Sweet, we're recording. All right, ladies, well, welcome to the workshop tonight. We are talking about how the internet is changing our brain, and I find it to be the most fascinating conversation because as we go through this, you'll have a better understanding as to why the internet and this medium in the last 30 years has changed our brain in ways that it has never happened in human existence in terms of technology and different mediums that have come about to help evolve the brain over time. And it's really a very fascinating conversation. And we all spend probably quite a bit of time on a computer, and the internet is, you know, a phone away, an iPad away, a laptop away. I mean, it is so integrated into our world. So understanding how it impacts our health and our brain, I think is a vital conversation. So let's just jump in here to understanding how much time we are actually spending on the internet. And these are older numbers. I mean, we're talking 2009. So this is 11, 12 years ago. I got majority of this information from the book called The Shallows, and then I also pulled from a book called Thrive, and that'll be at the end of the presentation. I can't remember the authors off the top of my head, but that's where the majority of this came from. So when we look at internet usage, I mean, back in 2009, so this is 11 years ago, on average, the adult was spending 12 hours a week. Spending an average of 12 hours a week. Adults with internet access, an average of 17 hours a week. And again, when we're talking about averages, that means that there could be people who are spending twice, 3 times as much, and people who are spending 0 time on the internet. So this is North America as a whole. Young adults in their 20s were averaging 19 hours per week, and children aged 2 to 11 were around 11 hours per week. And in 2008, with an adult survey of 27,500 people, 33% of leisure time was spent online. Chinese, I think in the Asian cultures, I think you see technology playing a much bigger role than here in the US or North America, but they're spending nearly half of their time. This was 12 years ago, so it's probably more than that than it was. And this doesn't even include time spent on mobile phones. So this is just laptops, you know, back in 2009. So spending significant amount of time. If we dive into, I find this interesting because text messaging represents most common use of, particularly in the younger generation, of time spent. I don't know why they call it online, but text messaging represents one of the most common uses of computers. I guess our phones are computers, particularly for the younger generation. And you can see back in 2009, adults, 400 texts per month. Teenagers, you know, 2,300 texts per month, right? Well over 2 trillion text messages are back in 2009 were sent. And I didn't even look up the numbers of what it potentially is now. But I mean, I look back on 11 years ago and my usage of phone, access to online, you know, texting, significantly different now than it was, you know, even 11 years ago for me and my use. So certainly with these kids growing up with cell phones and this main way of communicating, I've no idea how much more that is. So some people think that because we're using the internet more, we're probably not spending as much time on the TV or in front of the television, but we're actually finding is that television use hasn't changed at all. And again, this is back in 2009. Television use hasn't changed at all. In fact, they saw time spent in front of the tube increased by 2%, which was around 153 hours a month. That didn't change as use of and being on the internet. So in addition to being on the TV or in front of the tube, spending 8.5 hours looking at TV, in addition to, I don't know, what was that, 17 hours on average of being online if you had access to internet. And oftentimes they say they're seeing that users are frequently using multiple devices at the same time. So you've got TV, you've got phone, and maybe a laptop right in front of you. And maybe some of you guys are plugged into this, but the World Health Organization, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I think this came out in 2015. Maybe it was not even that long ago. But they said 0 to 2 years of age, there should be 0 hours of screen time. No screen time for these kids. This is a huge time for brain development, and we need to be doing activities that are engaging and stimulating. And 2 to 4 years of age, they say no more than 1 hour a day, and less is more. And I saw the American Pediatric Association said even up to 5 years of age, no more than 1 hour a day. So how many of you guys have been out to a restaurant and you see, you know, a child in their, you know, kid seat? I should probably figure out what these are called since I'm having one here soon. But in their child seat, and the mom or dad have the phone propped up for them to be engaged so they can have adult conversation, right? This is something that is utilized as a way to distract children. And again, no judgment here, but a way to, you know, engage your child so that mom and dad can do what they need to do. And what we're seeing, and when we dive into what's going on here, it can really have some drastic effects in terms of brain and how somebody has the capacity to engage in very different ways if they utilize screens at this young age or if they don't. Okay? So let's see here. Let's just dive into, we talk about TV, we talk about internet. Let's just talk about email for a second, because this is, I think, I spent a lot of time with work this weekend, and I told my husband, who is at the computer regularly, and their main source of communication is via email. And I don't know how people spend so much time on a computer and having to use email as a main way of communication. But anyway, this is 2012, so not 2009, so not so long ago, but found the average knowledge economy spends 28% of his or her time dealing with email. That's around 11 hours a week. And this is interesting because they found that an email, one email, okay, can take us 67 seconds to recover every time we receive one, right? So just think about every time your phone dings, ding, it can take a minute, over a minute for you to recover from that and get back into whatever you were doing at that time. This came out of the book Thrive, I believe, but this gal who worked for Apple and Microsoft talked about continuous partial attention. That's a state of where we're always partly tuned into everything while not totally being plugged in to one thing. She also talked about this email apnea, where you hold your breath for short times, and found that 80% of people experience email apnea, working, you know, and communicating via email. And so oxygen is important, right? Oxygen is important for the brain. So this is 11 hours a week on average. Back 8 years ago that we were spending via email. It's probably more than that now. And every email, there's a recovery time involved. so we can get back to what we're working on. And yet we're never actually totally plugged into one thing. We're plugged into multiple, right? So what is this inability to fully focus doing to our ability to be engaged in the world, right?
Right.
So let's look at this here. So your brain, I think neuroplasticity was a really trendy word. Maybe it's considered old hat now. But we used to think that your brain is this big chunk of matter and it doesn't really change, once you grow and develop. And this is back in the late 60s, where this researcher actually, what he did with these monkey experiments is that he, I think he broke a finger and then he sewed that finger to one of the other fingers. And then they mapped the brain of what was going on with the neural circuitry and the patterning of what the brain believed was going on here with the finger, because now instead of acting as two, they're acting as one, right? And they actually saw, wow, that the brain rapidly restructured at the cellular level depending on what was going on in the external environment. So we went from two fingers to now we have one. It changed the mapping in the brain to understand what was going on with these two fingers. And so that was the, I think, beginning or introduction of neuroplasticity, realizing that, wow, this brain responds to what's going on around us and it can change. And not only that, but it changes moment by moment depending on what is going on around us. And so you'll see me, or you'll see this in the presentation, but neurons that fire together, wire together, and the more that these neurons are firing together, the more it becomes an inked-in pattern within our system. So the more that we're doing something over and over and over, the more it becomes a pattern that will be utilized more consistently over time. So, brain's plasticity is not limited to somatosensory cortex. So somato is musculoskeletal, so the physical sensory input into the brain, but it's all neurocircuitry. So you have these words that I use in terms of sensory input into the brain. It's what we feel, it's what we hear, see, what we perceive in terms of what's going on in our environment, how we move and think, how we're learning, what we're remembering that happened, right? All of these pieces are changing the neural circuitry of our brain. So let's just take a step back here because I have to, because this has been the conversation in the office of 2020 is a year like no other. Duh. But a year like no other because we have been bombarded with this message of isolation, quarantine, don't go around any other people, be completely scared of your environment because of this umbrella of a pandemic. And I'm not taking away from the seriousness of COVID. I'm not at all. But if it is in every possible way engaging all of our senses and how we feel and what we see and what we're hearing, and then how we're learning to adapt to a new normal, and now we're remembering what's right and what's wrong and what's etiquette and how to keep ourselves safe. It's changing how the brain is wired, and this is a big deal. Yes, we're talking about the internet, but I just want you to look at the lens of how you're perceiving your world right now, and if what you're allowing in is creating more stress or allowing you to live within the confines of what's going on. So anyway, that was a side note. So I love this quote here because I took it directly from the book. He said, moment by moment, day by day, consciously or unconsciously, we alter the chemical flows of our synapses and change our brains. And when we hand down our habits of thought to our children through the examples we set, the schooling we provide, and the media we use, we hand down as well those modifications in the structure of our brains. Okay. I shared this probably, it's been 8 weeks ago, as I took this epigenetic course on how the current state of affairs are affecting moms and babies and women who are pregnant. And the researcher shared that our genetic expression, which plays into this neuroplasticity piece, goes back 14 generations with how those generations responded to stress and perceive their environment, right? So even though we see moment by moment that this can change, you can see how it takes a lot of work and consistency and time to create a new habit and to create a new behavior, right? So give yourself grace when you're thinking about, oh, I'm at it again and I'm doing this again. Understand these circuits are wired and they're inked in, and that's where you guys getting adjusted, that brain-body connection and that different external stimulus for you to have different awareness helps shift and change this in a completely different way, which is really fascinating. So anyway, so let's continue here. If you guys have questions, let me know, because this is a lot of information. So let's talk about neural circuits and the internet. So the internet has created an environment where it is meant to stimulate our every sense. We hear things, we see things, we're clicking on things. I mean, it is like a master stimulus system to engage every sense, okay? So, and when we do that, it's an environment that promotes quick reading, hurried and distracted thinking, and superficial learning. So another quote that I liked from The Shallows: if you were set up to invent a medium that would rewire our mental circuits as quickly and thoroughly as possible, you would probably end up designing something that looks and works a lot like the internet. Okay, so let's just take a step back here and just look at human existence and how our cognitive thought and brains have changed over time. Okay, the big ones that he covers in the book, he says time. Okay, time is a big technology piece that changed how we started structuring our days and thinking, right? And actually started in the monasteries because the monks needed a way to keep track of time and when they would meditate and sing. I don't know, they would do their singing. There's a word for it. What is it? Chanting. Thank you. Chanting. So they needed a way to structure their day around their chanting and prayers. And so that's when you first saw, outside of sunrise and sunset, time being used in more of an incremental system, right? And so then we have these bigger clocks, and then we've had, and over time, I'm condensing a lot of information, then we started wearing watches on our wrists. But time was a big technology concept that really changed how we perceive the day, what we could do during the day, what was working hours versus, leisure time, family time, right? Another big one was maps. You think about the cavemen back in the day, right? They take their stick and they draw, they draw in the dirt, this way to this rock is lion's den, right? Or whatever it was. And then as we got more advanced, we started creating maps of the environment, right? And not only just like regionally, but then we started creating larger maps. And then we started using maps for assessing, let's say in a wartime or a battle time, using maps to create strategies on how we're going to approach and battle this enemy of ours, right? So it really changed how we perceived space and our world with, you know, not just being at home, but there's more to the world outside of us, right? I kind of think about animals. You guys have cats, they're very comfortable in their house, right? But you take a cat outside of its environment and you start driving around the city or driving around the state, if they're not used to that, they have a really hard time adapting to this bigger world, right? Language and print, that was another big one. You know, this is, used to be our history was all verbal and auditory. And then they started writing things down. And not just writing down history, but then they started writing concepts and stories. And not just, you know, handwriting, because that was how books were passed on at times, and only the elite were able to read these books because only the elite could get these handwritten books. But then the printing press was invented, and it made reading and books available to the masses, so anybody could read and engage and you know, think of bigger concepts outside of themselves. So I mean, when we think about technology and what's changed our brains, it's time and the constructs of time, space and maps, language and words. And understand, these changes happened over hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, when you're talking about language and the printed word, right? This changed our cognitive ability to engage in our world and really take higher levels of thinking, not just for the elite, but for the masses, okay? So when we're talking about the internet, we're talking about 30, you know, 35, 40 years, and this massive change of external stimulus that has become so integrated into our world. You're talking about a massive change in our brain within a very short period of time. So when we go into this, you know, the internet delivers the kind of sensory and cognitive stimuli that is repetitive, it is intensive, it is interactive, and it is addictive. And it has been shown to result in very strong and rapid alterations in the brain circuits and functions, right? Because, I mean, we have triggers that every time we see our phone, it's, oh, we need to grab that. Oh, once I grab my phone, what do I do next? And, you know, how many characters is Twitter? 120, right? You're seeing magazine articles, you're seeing news articles, social media post requirements are much shorter and shorter and shorter, because our ability to focus and concentrate on these longer type concepts and really dive into it is less, because we don't have the brain capacity to do it, because we're not practicing and using our brain that way. So our brain is modified on a very large scale, both physically and functionally, each time we learn a new skill and develop a new ability. And I talked about this, neurons that fire together, wire together, and likewise neurons that don't fire together, don't wire together. So when we look at this right column over here, what the web has engaged us to do is, instead of really diving in deep and understanding the concepts of what's written, we scan. We get really good at scanning through the appropriate information that we need, right? Instead of composing sentences and paragraphs, we're exchanging texts. And the text, I mean, the new language is the acronyms and text messages, right? LOL. I don't use a lot of them, so not one of the millennials or the newer generation. But I mean, our language is changing where these acronyms are used instead of these longer sentences. And then we're hopping across links, going from one to the next, to the next, to the next, as opposed to quiet reflection and contemplation. I will challenge you, if any of you choose to dive into reading, you know, an article that's longer than 300 to 400 words, maybe 700, 1200, maybe more, you know, how challenging is that for you to stay with it and really sit with it and understand it and process it without being distracted to do something else, So I love that he used the word practice events. I mean, we are spending millions of practice events on the internet that the average human 1,000 years ago had no exposure to. So our brains are massively remodeled by this external exposure. And again, this is the researcher. When culture drives changes in the ways that we engage our brains, it creates different brains. Our minds strengthen specific heavily exercised processes, and their heavy use have neurological consequences. So when we use computers, smartphones, search engines, and other tools that stimulate brain cell alteration, neurotransmitter release, they're gradually strengthening these new neural pathways and weakening these old ones. Okay. This I found to be interesting. I mean, you can see from 2011 to 2016, the annual number of Google searches and how it's continuing to go up, right? I think I read the average person searches Google, 8 to 9 times a day, the average person, right? And so the brain response to internet use, right? Loss of long-term memory. Okay, so we are really great at scanning through, taking bits and pieces that are needed, but it's not activating the areas of the brain that are needed for long-term memory use or long-term memory. So let's see, increased reading activity. Regions of the brain associated with language, memory, visual processing. Promotes use of long-term memory. And deep reading means deep thinking. So when we're not reading and we're just, processing large pieces of data and scanning through, we're not firing these neurons that do this type of thinking for us, that engage this type of activity within our brain. Okay. And I found this, this is back in 2010, but I don't know if you guys had heard about this, but this was in South Korea, a couple who were addicted to online games, 12 hours every night at internet cafes. Their child actually starved to death because they were so addicted to their online games. And so I never heard what happened to these folks, but this is a reality of when we're so engaged and addicted and our brain is wired in a way that, we need that stimulus. This is the impacts of that. And I think I just pulled up these pictures because this is kind of like Zombieland for us in 2020, this is how we are engaging with our community. And it's an online community that we are engaged in. And this picture of this baby in this carrier, it's like putting them right in front of a monitor. How old is that baby? Not very old, right? So this is kind of where things are moving, and it's not necessarily a good thing, in my opinion, in terms of if we're looking at wanting children, adults to have really healthy brains and behaviors and abilities to engage in a way of, using all parts of the brain, not just this quick scanning of everything and taking bits and pieces and having really short attention spans. So anyway, here's Nicholas Carr and Ariana Huffington. That's where I took a lot of this data. But in Thrive, Ariana, one of the things she talked about was just doing a technology fast and structuring your day where you say, you know what, after this time, I am, unplugging from my technology, or I'm going to read and engage in, these types of books, and I'm going to journal about it. It just being really intentional about, number one, your internet use, the time you're spending on it, and how you can utilize those other areas of the brain to create healthy circuitry, so that if you want to support a healthy long-term memory, and you want to be able to be in a state where you can contemplate and really understand concepts, it's going to take work and intention, because this is our world, right? So it is 30 minutes, and any questions? I mean, I got 2 of you left here. So Sharon, oh yeah.
I got 2 questions. Thanks, Miaken. That was enlightening as always to see the metrics. My 2 questions related to reading. Does deep reading translate to reading just for pleasure? Novels or nonfictions, whatever we might want to read, or is it more towards the academic reading that we're looking for that deep reading and creating a different pattern in our thinking and our thought processes?
That's a great question, Sharon. As I was going through this, I was thinking, is it including fiction in this? Because it's been a little bit since I've referenced The Shallows. But I would say doing any type of reading, whether it's a fiction or nonfiction, you are diving into, whether it's a world or, a different frame of mind in terms of, bettering yourself or self-reflection. I mean, I think it's any type of reading, because you talk to the people who really dive into novels, and they talk about how, I could smell the sea and I could feel the breeze, of that beach that, the characters were in. And so I think that is really diving into an experience that is activating that portion of the brain,
Right. And sometimes even the plots, just holding on to all the characters in the plots.
Totally.
The other thing related to reading is, and I'm hoping the answer is no, but does a e-reader, a Kindle, fall into the safe zone or the sketch zone?
Yeah, they talked about Kindles, Nooks, but having these digital books fall into more internet online usage.
They do.
I'll have to look into the details, because I was reading into it last night, but they said there's definitely a difference with having a hard copy in a book and having a Kindle, an iPad, a Nook, that sort of thing. So, I mean, I would say that falls more into net usage, even though you're still engaging those parts of the brain. I'll have to dive into that, Sharon, and send you some details, because that's a good question.
I know they say that I think the blue light factor, the other thing that's influencing our, ability to sleep and so forth, that supposedly it's less with those than looking at your laptop. But I'm a little suspicious personally, just through some personal experiences I'm having with sleep issues.
Yeah. Yes. And then you dive into all of those other pieces that can contribute to stress to a body that we're not even talking about how the brain is processing,
Right.
So
thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Sharon. It's great to have you. Virginia, do you have any questions? I'm going 33 minutes. I'm 3 minutes over.
You're good. No, that was great. Thank you. I thought that was super informative, but no, I do not have any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we went through a lot of information. I guess my challenge to you would be, if you find value in taking a pause on your internet usage, what can you do instead of, spending 30 minutes on, say, a Facebook or, reading online articles, whatever it may be. But if you ever want to just have some awareness, it's check in with yourself as far as how quickly you're scrolling through that Facebook feed or that Instagram feed, and how, what your ability is in terms of your interest of reading descriptions or clicking on an article, going to the article. Do you read the whole thing? You're reading bits and pieces of it, because that'll give you a really good idea of how your brain is processing information. So.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I force myself to read articles all the way to the end, because it is really easy to just read the first paragraph and then zip. It's just nope. Go back to it. So
I agree. It's hard. And It is because we have been, it's just the nature of the beast of the internet. So
It's just strange. I remember my attention span being so much better when I was younger. I'd read whole books and consume them, and now it's just like, there's just so much sensory overload.